In boxing, there's been a narrative that's been going on over the past few years, and it kind of goes a little bit something like this. Too many champions are out there avoiding each other. You've got all these different boxing sanctioning bodies, at least 4 of them, 5 if you include Ring Magazine, because they also sanction championships. And so they have a champion at, a dozen and a half different weight classes once you include all of the super and junior weight classes, which really, in my opinion, are just excuses for guys to not make weight at the existing weight classes. But basically, a lot of these champions are out there carrying around belts saying that they're the world champion. And really, when you think about it, there can only be one world champion. But the reason why they're avoiding each other is because there's something that has become very, very coveted, in the sport of professional boxing. And that is having that 0 in your record, to be undefeated. Because if any of these boxers go out and they fight another guy with a 0 in their record, basically what they're doing is they're losing their Mayweather bid. They're that chance to go their entire career without ever having lost a fight, and to cash out on it in a big, big way at the end of it by being this huge megastar who never lost a fight. Now, as it so happens, boxing is not the only combat sport where the champions are avoiding each other. I mean, in MMA, in particular, in the UFC, there are 2 champions right now that are avoiding each other. And of course, I'm talking about the welterweight champion of the world, Kamaru Usman, and the middleweight champion of the world, Israel Adesanya. Both of these guys are in a very, very similar situation. Both looking at champions that, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 outliers, these are guys that have basically cleaned out their division. And so unless they want to turn around and go through every existing challenger all over again, and in the case of both men, there are some challengers that they have fought at least a couple of times, there's not really a lot there for them to do in their existing weight classes. And so in a situation like this is where you start to look at these super fights that a lot of people like to talk about. And this is the time when you make one. Because if you don't, there's no other way to make either of these guys interesting. And so you've got 2 divisions that will go stagnant if you don't do something with these guys at the top. And so basically what people start to talk about doing is matching them up. And you hear it all the time. I think maybe the most pervasive one that never happened was George St. Pierre, welterweight champion of the world, versus Anderson Silva, middleweight champion of the world, pardon me. And that was a fight that we never did get. We didn't get that one, which is kind of a shame because it would have been a good one. And right now, it's looking like we are not ever going to get Kamaru Usman versus Israel Adesanya because they won't fight each other. Not because either guy is afraid to risk something in their record. As a matter of fact, I don't think that either of those guys. Adesanya definitely doesn't. I don't believe that Usman has a 0 in his record to risk there. I feel a little bit silly now. I should have checked that before I started recording. Do apologize that, but leave it in the we'll talk about it in the comments if you want. But in either case, that's not the reason why either one of these guys is avoiding the other guy. It's because they don't want, they don't want to risk. They don't want to take a champion from Africa off the board. They don't want to take 2 champions, put them on one guy from Africa. They want to have as many African champions as they can have. It's a nationalism thing. I'm not even going to criticize it. I don't have any problem with that. And so there is some irony in this, because while these 2 guys are trying to avoid each other, they both do happen to be eyeballing the exact same prize as a substitute. They are both looking at the light heavyweight championship of the world, currently held by Glover Teixeira. Now, Israel Adesanya, he's actually already tried that out once. It didn't go very well with him with Jan Blachowicz. Jan was the one that gave him the one in his record. Jan is the one who is the one in Israel Adesanya's record. Maybe he thinks his chances are a little bit better against Glover Teixeira. Glover Teixeira has shocked the world before, so it's not unthinkable that he could do so again. But really, neither one of these two guys should write that ticket just yet, because there is one more guy out there that's basically trying to screw with both of their plans. And that guy is UFC middleweight Alex Pereira. Now, as it stands right now, Pereira's only had 2 fights in the UFC. I mean, if Adesanya and Usman both make a play for the light heavyweight championship at the same time, then it's pretty reasonable to assume that they're going to have to cross paths on their way to it. I'm not entirely sure what their line of thinking is in terms of this being a substitute for fighting one another. But the simple fact of the matter is that if 2 guys don't want to fight each other, it is very difficult to make them do that. Both of them resulted in victories. One was admittedly much more spectacular than the other. But basically, Alex Pereira, he's kind of in a little bit of a race right now. He's in a race to get himself into title contention before Israel Adesanya kicks off and tries to make another run at the light heavyweight championship. They've both said that they don't want to. They both made their reasons clear. Nothing in the world is going to change that, with the exception of another contender at either weight class. There are some guys who are close, but they're still a little bit of a ways off. Now, one of the things more widely known about Alex Pereira is that he, as a matter of fact, he holds victories over Israel Adesanya. Not in MMA, he holds those victories in kickboxing. Although, arguably, Israel Adesanya in an MMA octagon and Israel Adesanya in a kickboxing ring really have yet to be extremely different. I mean, kickboxers are really only starting to really come into their day in MMA. It's actually taken quite a while. But now that they're there, trainers seem to have finally fine-tuned that discipline enough that it's viable as a base for an MMA fighter. And so then the big one thing that would be missing in a lot of these fights, is the ability of a kickboxer to grapple. They have to learn some wrestling. They have to learn some jiu-jitsu. And whatever Israel Adesanya has learned about wrestling or jiu-jitsu, he hasn't really had to show us yet. And Alex Pereira, he hasn't shown us very much of it. He's shown us a little bit. But in his short MMA career, it really has yet to define one of his fights. So, I mean, yes, Alex Pereira is the new guy. Yes, there is no reason to just assume that he is going to run straight to the middleweight championship of the world. But I think it is safe to say that if he does get himself into title contention, there is every reason in the world to think that he might be a threat to Israel Adesanya. And that would change everything for both of these fighters. Because now, instead of both of these guys looking to leapfrog all the way up to the light heavyweight championship of the world, including Kamaru Usman, who would actually have to clear an entire other division and add 35 pounds to be competitive at that weight class. Now suddenly there's a scenario emerges where you might actually look at trying to make Kamaru Usman a champ at welterweight and middleweight. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of moving parts here still, perhaps more so for Kamaru Usman than for Israel Adesanya, because out there you still do have a few guys that, depending on what happens within the next year, could become fresh challengers for Usman. Of course, talking about guys like Leon Edwards, guys like Bilal Muhammad, guys like Hamzat Chimaev, who a lot of people are basically coronating as the next welterweight champion of the world. Personally, I'm not so sure about that. I wouldn't run away to the bank with that check just yet. And especially on the middleweight side of this equation, time is really just not on Alex Pereira's side. Let's also acknowledge that. I mean, ahead of Israel Adesanya, at middleweight, who is there? It's Jared Cannonier. That's about it. I do stand firm in my opinion that middleweight is potentially the most exciting division in MMA. You know, everybody there has knockout power. Everybody can grapple. Everybody is still fast. Basically, all the fighters, they do need to be able to do everything and do everything well. But as it pertains to the current batch of contenders at middleweight, not an exciting bunch. You know, definitely not compared to, say, at lightweight. And certainly not with some of the more exciting potential contenders. You know, of course, speaking about Kevin Holland here, you know, running into so much hard luck at middleweight that he's decided to go down to welterweight, which makes for another moving part for Kamaru Usman. But if Alex Pereira keeps taking fights at the rate that he's taking them and keeps winning, it's not impossible that he might manage to get himself to be the guy to challenge Israel Adesanya, become that new contender that's basically going to derail the plans of both men for the light heavyweight championship. And personally, I hope that he does, because frankly, I think that's the thing that is most likely to make either one of these divisions interesting again.